that we will be reckoned wise among the nations when we keep God's laws. So let me try to give you the structure of the argument as it comes through in Ben Sira. The first part of the argument is familiar to us from Proverbs chapter 8. God uses wisdom. Wisdom, in a sense, is God's firstborn. And God then uses wisdom to plan the cosmos. In 20th and 21st century religious conservatism, you have a particular scientific hypothesis which stands as an alternative to Darwinism, called intelligent design theory. Intelligent design theory. So God's intelligence is manifest in the design of the cosmos. This is, of course, a very famous argument. You see this in the great watchmaker arguments of the 18th century. You look around, you see the universe, it's filled with evidence of design, and that's because it was designed, in fact, by an intelligent designer. So that's not a new argument in the 18th century, and Ben Sira has his own version of it, although he doesn't express himself philosophically, but it's that same general argument. So therefore, all of the cosmos and all of life reflects God's wisdom. God's wisdom can be sought, by extension, in any culture. It's not peculiar to Judaism. However, and now Ben Sira connects that pillar of biblical thought with another, maybe even more substantial pillar of biblical thought, which is the election of Israel. And this is part of the main story of the Hebrew Bible from Genesis 12, where God calls Abraham and renews that call through Isaac and renews that call through Jacob. And then Exodus 19, when God has all the children of Israel standing around Mount Sinai and says, Ki li kol haaretz, the whole earth is mine, va'atem tihiyu li sigula, but you're going to be my special treasure because you are going to bring to reality something that I really want for the whole world. You're going to be a mamlechet kohanim vegoy kadosh, a kingdom of priests, a holy people. Now that text always resonates with me because I remember what Egyptian priests are like in the eyes of the Bible. In Genesis, when the 7 years of famine strike, all the Egyptians give up their freedom. They all become serfs to Pharaoh in exchange for being sustained through the famine, except for the priests. The priests have their daily grain because of a dole. They don't have to give up their freedom to avoid starvation. So if you're an Israelite of that era, gathered around Mount Sinai, and God says to you, you will be a kingdom of priests, what God is saying is that for the first time in human history, there's going to be a nation where everyone is equal under God. We don't have these gradations of socioeconomic status built into the law. A nation of priests, a holy, therefore distinct, extraordinary nation, means, for the first time, a nation where truly, because God is our loving parent, we're all God's children. We're all equal in God's sight. What a revolutionary idea. And Ben Sira would add, what a wise idea. So Ben Sira connects the universalism of the wisdom tradition with the particularism. I don't want to use the word nationalism. It's very polemical nowadays. But the particularism of the doctrine of the election of Israel. Putting them together, Ben Sira comes up with the third stage of his argument. While God's wisdom is accessible to all people through a contemplation of nature and of human affairs, the Israelites, in addition to that, have another channel for the appreciation and the internalization of God's wisdom. And that added channel is the covenant. So the Israelite, the Jew, by the way, do you know how Israelites came to be called Jews? Because after the destruction of Sennacherib, when the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel were dispersed and lost to history, the remaining tribe was Judah, Yehudah. So to be a Judean, Yehudi, came to be tantamount to being an Israelite, because there weren't Israelites left. And the proof of this is found in the book of Esther, chapter 2, where there's one guy who happens to be from the tribe of Benjamin, and that is Mordecai. But he's called Ish Yehudi. It would make no sense. It would be a self-contradiction to say that a certain Judean was Mordecai the Benjamite. But it's not a contradiction to say a certain Jew was Mordecai the Benjaminite, because the word Jew had expanded, changed its meaning from one tribe to a member of the house of Israel. So for the Jewish people, Ben Sira would say, they can access divine wisdom through the faithful observance of God's commandments. So that takes the claim of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 6, to another level. The whole of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. Ben Sira writes in chapter 24, complete wisdom is the fulfillment of the law. Now, this means that the divine choice of Israel includes a divine decision to make Jerusalem, and in particular the temple, the seat of wisdom. So that's the first major argument in Ben Sira. The second major argument is one that almost has to follow upon the first. Because when we claim, as Proverbs claims, that wisdom will give you a good life, what happens when you pursue wisdom and the circumstances of your life ain't so great? What happens when the righteous person has evil befall him? What happens when the wicked prosper? And we saw in the writings of Kohelet that this gnawing, nagging problem can lead to great resignation. Kohelet more or less throws up his hands and says, God's in heaven, better not get angry, but there's a lot of evil in this world, and that's just the way it is. Ben Sira wants to make a more, I would say, pious and therefore more traditional response to that. So Ben Sira's second major argument, after the first one of equating the wisdom tradition with the fear of the Lord and that with the observance of the law, the second one is to defend that against skeptical questioning. So when life gets in the way, what can Ben Sira say? I believe that he has three basic responses to that. The first is that adversity isn't always, or isn't only, or isn't a counter-example to his claim in Providence. Adversity could be part of God's plan. And here we have some familiar images. The potter tests the pot. Right? The refiner has to subject the gold to the flame. And this kind of argument we see in chapter 2 of Ben Sira. Let me share a little bit of it with you. Chapter 2, verse 1 and following. My son, typically this is the father speaking to the son, or the master speaking to the disciple using filial language. My son, when you come to serve the Lord, prepare yourself for testing. Then, verse 4. Accept whatever befalls you. In periods of humiliation, be patient. For in fire, gold is tested, and those God favors in the crucible of humiliation. Trust God, and He will help you. Make straight your ways and hope in Him. Now, if your adversity is from the Lord, it's going to be okay. And you'd rather deal with that than adversity which just comes from human hatred. So he wants you to strive to understand that humbling yourself before life's reverses by understanding that they may have come from God is going ultimately to lead you to be rewarded still more by God. The next argument is what we've already alluded to in my point that Sophocles, Aeschylus, Solon anticipate what Ben Sira says about the very end of your life. In short, the happiness of the righteousness may only be clear at the very, very end. Conversely, the abasement of the wicked may only be clear at the very, very end. Let me turn to chapter 30 of Ben Sira. By the way, the chapter 30, verse 14, has a verse that many of us should know because we might be going through this right now. Better the poor in vigorous health than the rich with bodily ills. We might know the unique wisdom of that, some of us right now. Then he says, I'm sorry, I lost my place, I'm sorry. Whoever loves his son, this is chapter 30, chastises him often. Now, you got to have a little bit of tough love so that your kid doesn't end up being a spoiled brat like the children of King David were. Right? Amnon and Absalom and so on. You got to keep them on the straight and narrow, and then they're going to come to good, and that's going to be good for you. If you love your son, chastise him often, that he may be a joy to the father when he grows up. Now, this is the important part. Verse 4, at the father's death, he, the father, will not seem dead, since he leaves after him one like himself. We begin to have an answer to this question of what about good people who die without seeing their reward in their lifetime? We don't yet have a clearly articulated vision of posthumous retribution. But keep coming back. When we get to the wisdom of Solomon, we're finally going to see that. But we have this notion of your descendants being a kind of posthumous providence. If you are a wise and good parent, you're increasing the odds of producing a wise and good child. And that child will be part of your reward. So again, verse 4, at the father's death, he will not seem dead, since he leaves after him one like himself. Verse 5, whom he looks upon through life with joy, and even in death without regret. The avenger he leaves against his foes, and the one to repay his friends with kindness. Are you following the ad campaign from WHRO radio station about leave a bequest? Yes. So-and-so passed away in the year 2001, and today she is benefiting 4 or 5 or 6 good causes, right? She lives forever through her good works, right? And in the university world, you know, our furnishings, our physical environment is filled with the names of benefactors now deceased, right? You don't go to the no-name building of arts and letters. The naming often costs something. And that's one way of memorializing the dead. So it's one way of keeping their memory present. Ben Sira connects that to his defense of the traditional notion of divine providence. Now, what about the other way? What if you don't raise your child right? Whoever spoils his son will have wounds to bandage and will quake inwardly at every outcry. A colt untamed turns out stubborn. A son left to himself grows up unruly. Pamper your child and he will be a terror to you. Indulge him and he will bring you grief. Share not in his frivolity, lest you share in his sorrow, when finally your teeth are gritted in remorse. Now, what's the bottom line of this failure to educate? Lest he become stubborn, disobey you, and your last breath be brought on by him. So the converse of leaving a good son because you have been righteous and therefore you get your reward is quite the opposite. You will find a punishment, and the punishment is of your own doing, and that too is divine providence. So we have, as I mentioned, three defenses of providence. The first is that adversity can be a test of fidelity, and therefore it can be purifying. The second is that the righteous can look forward to a happy death, and the unrighteous can look forward to miserable regret on their deathbed. So even if divine retribution only comes at the very last minute, then it is still significant. On this subject, I want to confess my sins. Early in my career of serving a congregation, I learned a painful lesson that we must never have a public liturgical reading without testing it first. Now, I look at the Hebrew, and I assume that we have to read in translation. So here's an example of a high holiday poem that I read in the Hebrew, didn't look at the translation, authorized a public recitation of it, heard it, and realized how silly I'd been. This is in the Rosh Hashanah liturgy. It's the Judgment Day. God is King. We're having our annual spiritual checkup. And there's a poem which says, Ad yom moto tichake lo, lehetiv lo la'acharito. Until man's dying day, you wait for him, O God, in order to make it good for him in the final analysis. But the translation that I was using, unwittingly, a 1939 translation by a very, very great rabbi from Hartford, Connecticut, named Morris Silverman, said, Until man's dying day dost thou wait for him. Perchance he will repent, and thou wilt bless his latter end. So we read it, and I instantly realized never again will I authorize a reading without sound testing it. But that's the notion here. At the very last minute, perhaps a person will repent and God's providence will be vindicated. And finally, the significance of the descendants is part of this picture of providence. I understand that this last argument becomes magnified in a very important way in Ben Sira, and it leads to what I think is the last major section of the book, which is history as a confirmation of wisdom. This is the very famous passage known as In Praise of Famous Men, where Ben Sira gives us a summary of the history of the biblical process, and continues into the post-biblical era with a beautiful encomium. Really, it is a Greek-style encomium to the high priest of the generation of Ben Sira's maturity, a high priest who's known in Jewish tradition as Simon the Just, Shimeon HaTzadik, but we know this to have been the high priest Simon who served from the 220s before the Common Era and who died in 196. So that gives us a close handle on when the book was written, because if you look at the encomium, it looks as if the high priest has died before he writes this. On the other hand, there's no mention of Antiochus IV and the terrible persecutions of Israel, so that's 175. So we can infer that this book was written in the 20-year span between 195 and 175. So the praise of famous men, they were righteous, and therefore their fame lives on, and that is part of their reward too. So the obvious, we call this musar, the ethical lesson that you should take is that you too should be righteous, and you will be blessed by posterity. Now, I mentioned before that we see an echo of Ben Sira's concern. Oh God, when are you going to vindicate yourself? When are you going to give it to the nations who have done terrible things to us? And this is found in Ben Sira chapter 36. In a way, this sounds very biblical because the Bible is filled with righteous indignation and impassioned plea. So the kind of smooth, unruffled surface of wisdom, now there's a different sound when he's praying for God to rise up and give it to all the enemies. A little bit like what you see in Psalm 94. Oh God, bring retribution down onto those horrible people. Here in chapter 36, come to our aid, God of the universe, and put all the nations in dread of you. Raise your hand against the foreign folk, that they may see your mighty deeds. As you have used us to show them your holiness, so now use them to show us your glory. Thus they will know, as we know, that there is no God but you. Give new signs and work new wonders. Show forth the splendor of your right hand and arm. The whole Bible is anti-lefty. I'm sorry for that. When I have a chance to translate it, I don't say right, I say dominant. Rouse your anger, pour out wrath, humble the enemy, scatter the foe, hasten the ending, appoint the time when your mighty deeds are to be proclaimed. This is a prayer for the end of days. You see it in Amos, you see it in Isaiah, you see it throughout the biblical process. Now, I think a final word about Ben Sira. In a Christian setting, we are sometimes thinking that you have the prophetic versus the priestly models of piety. Prophetic would be social justice. In Christian circles, we call it social gospel. Concern for the poor, concern for the disadvantaged, speaking truth to power. We think of that as the prophetic. But in truth, that's not all the prophets spoke about. The prophets were very annoyed about idolatry, not only annoyed about the rich oppressing the poor. And conventionally, we sometimes think of the priest as the establishment kind of religious figure. But for Ben Sira, the true priest and the true advocate for social concerns are merged. So just a little bit on that. In Ben Sira, chapter 35, verse 6, and chapter 35, verse 2, that part of 35, Ben Sira says that, first of all, fulfilling the commandments in general is the true sacrifice. He likes sacrifices. He's not trying to say don't give sacrifices. But he says the priests give sacrifices, but every one of us can fulfill God's commandments, and that is our sacrifice. And of all the sacrifices, verse 6, what is the finest sacrifice? That is the sacrifice of almsgiving, which makes the link between the sacrificial cultus in the temple and the kinds of sacrifices that each of us has within our power to give. And so Ben Sira emerges as a link between the piety of the Bible and the religious thought of later generations, including the thought of rabbinic Judaism, and in other circles, the thought of the Christian faith community, which after all is to be credited for preserving the book so that we could read it today. Thank you.